Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into a question that's, well, as old as humanity itself, really. It's what many of us grapple with, in quiet moments, maybe in prayer.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental challenge to how we see the divine, our place in the world. The big one. If God exists, why is there suffering?
And it's not just abstract, is it? It's deeply personal.
Exactly. It was brought home recently by a really poignant question from a 14-year-old Joe. He basically asked, look, if God made us and is supposed to give happiness, why do the needy suffer so much? Is God, biased?
It's a profound query. Joe's really put his finger on what philosophers often call the problem of evil.
Right.
At its heart, it's that challenge. How do you reconcile a God who's meant to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and totally good with the undeniable reality of pain, of struggle in our world?
So our mission today is to kind of unpack this ancient dilemma.
Yeah, exactly. We'll explore the core arguments, look at how different thinkers, different traditions have tried to bridge that seemingly impossible gap. Okay. The goal really is just to shed light on some different perspective, offer you maybe a clearer way to think about this enduring mystery.
Okay, let's unpack it then. The classic way it's put is, it's startlingly simple, isn't it? But so hard to answer.
It is.
If God is truly all-powerful, omnipotent, and all-knowing, omniscient, and also profoundly loving, then why does suffering persist? It feels like a core contradiction. People have puzzled over this for millennia.
Yeah. And what often helps, I think, to highlight the tension is the parental analogy.
Okay.
Think about human parents, right? We love our kids. We certainly don't want them to suffer.
Well, of course not.
But we're limited. Our power isn't infinite. We do our best, but sometimes it's just not enough. We don't have limitless power or knowledge.
So that makes the paradox even sharper, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, if a human parent with all their limits would stop the suffering if they could,
Right.
then how do we understand a heavenly parent figure who is supposed to be limitless, limitless power, knowledge, love? Why doesn't that parent stop all the suffering?
That's it. That's the core tension Joe is probably feeling.
Yeah.
And look, many answers have been proposed over the centuries. As one philosopher pointed out, none of them are completely convincing on their own.
It really says something about how deep the problem is.
It does.
So, okay, if that's the core paradox, what are some of the common ways people have tried to square this circle? I've definitely heard the idea that maybe suffering serves a purpose, like it builds resilience or something.
That's one of the most common ones. The character building theory, you could call it.
Right.
The basic idea is suffering makes you stronger. It forges resilience, maybe deemer character.
Okay. Makes intuitive sense sometimes.
When you look closely, it immediately runs into problems, strong counter-argument.
Like what?
Well, how does the suffering of a newborn baby, for instance, or a starving child who just dies young in some underprivileged part of the world, how does that lead to strength or character development?
Yeah. Or an animal suffering for ages.
Exactly. It just doesn't seem to apply universally in a way that feels, comforting or complete.
That definitely highlights the limits there. But what about those cases where struggle does seem necessary? I'm thinking of that classic analogy, the caterpillar.
The cocoon, yes.
Yeah, needing to fight its way out. And that struggle is supposedly what develops its wings so it can fly.
Yeah.
How do people who hold this view use that?
They absolutely use that analogy. It's central for some. The suggestion is, yes, we need this struggle, maybe even this suffering, to become spiritually stronger, to sort of earn our wings, spiritually speaking.
Okay.
It gets applied to individual spiritual growth, or this idea of human flourishing through facing adversity. And this whole branch of theology, by the way, that tries to justify God's ways in the face of evil, it's called theodicy.
Theodicy. Right. Like an intellectual defense for God.
Pretty much. But as you pointed out, that caterpillar analogy, it struggles to account for all suffering, especially the suffering of the innocent or just overwhelming, seemingly pointless pain. It doesn't cover everything.
So if the character building argument, especially with innocent suffering, doesn't quite satisfy everyone, what other major frameworks have emerged from different traditions, maybe?
Well, if we turn east to philosophies like Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, a really common and powerful answer is the law of karma.
Karma. Okay, I've heard of that, of course. How does it apply here?
Here, the idea is that suffering isn't God's fault, not directly anyway. It's seen as the consequence of one's own actions.
Cause and effect.
Exactly, a kind of cosmic law of cause and effect. Your actions, whether in this life or maybe even a past one, according to some traditions, create consequences. And those consequences eventually manifest as your experiences, good or bad.
It's funny how we react to that, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
if you win the lottery, you don't usually question if you deserved it.
Right. You just accept the good fortune.
The moment something bad happens, it's immediately, why me? What did I do to deserve this?
It's a very human tendency, yeah. And this is where it gets really, really interesting and maybe challenging. Many people might say, I lost faith because I prayed, and yet my loved one still suffered. Or I suffered terribly.
Understandable, emotionally.
Absolutely understandable. But consider the perspective of someone like Professor Houston Smith,
Yeah.
Author of The World's Religions, still a standard text.
Yeah, I know the book.
He experienced something truly awful. His granddaughter, whom he deeply loved, was murdered.
Oh, wow. That's incredibly hard. A personal tragedy of the highest order. How did someone so steeped in world religions deal with that?
Well, apparently he was asked in a radio interview, did he still believe in God after that, after such a profound loss?
What did he say?
He reportedly replied something like, how absurd. Yeah. He said, people have died and been murdered all over the world throughout all of history. Just because today it happens to be my granddaughter, I should stop believing in God. How absurd.
Wow. That's a powerful perspective.
It is. His point wasn't to diminish the grief, not at all. It was that his belief or disbelief in God was a separate matter. Personal suffering, however immense, couldn't be the sole or even rational basis for abandoning that belief.
It really puts suffering in a different context.
Yeah.
Like, it's a universal human condition, part of being here, not just a personal thing aimed at you by God.
Exactly. And the key insight with karma, really, is how it shifts the focus. It's not about an external divine judge handing out suffering. It's more about internal self-generated consequences within a kind of moral universe. It gives agency back, in a way.
That perspective definitely shifts the responsibility, yeah. Moves away from blaming God directly. What other big ideas are out there? Any other schools of thought with unique takes?
Another really profound insight comes from the Buddha. The idea that all compounded things decay.
All compounded things decay, meaning...
Meaning everything in this world that's made up of parts, which is pretty much everything. It's temporary, it's transitory.
Yeah.
So any situation, any person, any relationship that we cherish, it's by its very nature impermanent. It will change. It will diminish or break apart or melt away eventually.
Our bodies age, our tastes change.
The world itself is constantly changing, yeah. Nothing stays the same.
So, because everything we value is inherently temporary, and we know deep down it won't last forever. Suffering is just an inevitable consequence of that transitoriness. Like, whatever has come together will eventually fall apart.
Precisely. That's a core insight from Buddhism.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating, truly fascinating, is that even with this seemingly bleak prognosis, suffering is inevitable because things fall apart. Indian philosophy generally, as described by Professor Heinrich Zimmer, is actually driven by this spirit of unbounded optimism.
Unbounded optimism.
Well,
sounds counterintuitive, given the inevitability of suffering and decay.
Mm-hmm.
How did that work?
Because while these philosophies, Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, they fully acknowledge the suffering inherent in the world, absolutely. They all offer a solution, a way out. They call it different things, moksha, kaivalya, nirvana, depending on the tradition. But the point is, yes, the prognosis about the world might seem negative, things decay, suffering happens, but the ultimate point is liberation. There's an escape hatch, an ultimate freedom from this cycle possible.
So the optimism comes from the existence of a path out of the suffering.
Exactly. That's why, from their perspective, religion is fundamentally positive. It diagnoses the problem, sure, but crucially it says, there is a solution to the sufferings of the world, and here's the path to find it. It offers liberation.
This brings us back then to Joe's specific question, that very personal angle. Does God actually create suffering? Deliberately make people poor or needy so that the rest of us can help them and become good or saints in the process? Is God biased like that?
Right. To answer Joe's question directly, no. That's not how these traditions generally see it. God does not make people suffer for your sake.
Okay, good to clarify that.
Yeah, the idea that God is sort of engineering suffering just to give you sainthood points or to create opportunities for others to be good, that's not really it. That would imply a rather cruel, manipulative, and biased deity, wouldn't it?
It would. So what is the real nature of the transformation then, if it's not some divine setup?
It's more about through engaging with your own suffering, understanding it, and also, crucially, through the act of helping others who are suffering, You transform yourself.
Ah, so the transformation is internal, in the person doing the helping.
Yes, it's a personal journey. Growth, change. The act of compassion refines the giver, maybe even more than the receiver sometimes. It's about your own development through connection and action.
So it's not about fixing the whole world, maybe.
Well, look, even the greatest spiritual figures throughout history haven't magically eliminated all the world's suffering, have they?
No, clearly not. The world's still
Yeah.
a pretty tough place in many ways.
Exactly. So perhaps it's less about solving everything externally and more about what we can do. We can engage in helping others. We can work on ourselves through that process. We do the best we can, in this vast sea of suffering, recognizing that our actions, our compassion, they have the power to change us.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've navigated this really complex landscape, ancient philosophical problems, very personal feelings, different traditions, trying to make sense of suffering when there's this idea of a loving God. And as Professor Arthur Herman's book apparently showed, that there's something like 23 different answers floating around for why suffering exists if God does.
At least, and none, as we said, are completely knocked down, universally convincing on their own.
Right.
And maybe this deep dive shows us that the most profound answers aren't really found in one simple explanation anyway. Perhaps it's more about how we respond, how we live with the enduring reality of suffering, of impermanence. It's less about finding the single answer, and maybe more about the ongoing human quest for meaning, for compassion, within a world that often includes pain.
So maybe the real question for you listening is, what does understanding these different perspectives, these different attempts to grapple with suffering, what does that inspire you to reflect on about your own experiences, or maybe about your own motivation to act in the world?
A good place to leave it.
We hope this deep dive has given you a clearer lens, maybe some new angles, to view this incredibly tough, age-old question.